Welcome to the Orbital Sunrise Podcast, sharing ideas that are catalysts for action to drive an inclusive and equitable world. Your hosts are
Elizabeth Harrison, ocean engineer, presenter and engineering communicator and futurist.
And Ruth Harrison, aerospace engineer, space industry communicator and diversity advocate.
This Orbital Sunrise podcast will educate and empower people by sharing the impacts of STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths. Our Series 1 key themes are unpacking the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 8, economic growth, humanising STEM, thought leadership and engineering futurist.
We would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are broadcasting today, acknowledge their continuing connection to the land, air and sea, and pay our respects to their elders past and present. We extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today. If you would like to support our podcast, please share with your friends, leave a review, or check out our Patreon site. Welcome to episode 2 of the Orbital Sunrise Podcast. My name is Ruth Harrison, rocket woman, space specialist and engineer, and I would like to introduce my co-host, Elizabeth Harrison, ocean woman, ocean engineer and futurist.
Hi Ruth, and thanks for that welcome. It's pretty exciting actually today. Today we welcome our special guest, Dr. Margaret Cook, author of A River with a City Problem. Very timely with the recent floods and flooding in southeast Queensland and northern half of New South Wales, as well as the extended heavy and constant rain that we've seen along half of the east coast of mainland Australia, from Maryborough to Brisbane to the south, all the way down to the south coast of New South Wales. So Dr. Margaret Cook is an author and history lecturer at the University of Sunshine Coast and holds an honorary research fellow positions at the La Trobe University and University of Queensland. She has been a freelance historian for many years, working in the heritage, museum, government and private sectors and publishing on numerous topics. She also holds a PhD in history from the University of Queensland, and her current research interests include natural disasters, water politics, and environmental history, where I have encountered her at numerous engineering and water events over the last 3 years. And she's also a recipient of the John and Ruth Cook Medal of Distinction for Excellence in Historiography, Historical Research and Writing in 2020. So welcome, Margaret. Thanks for coming and joining us on Orbital Sunrise Podcast.
Thanks very much for having me. This is very exciting.
I know, I'm very excited. I read your book over the weekend. It was fantastic. So I'm very, very excited.
Thank you very much. Yeah, well, I've known Elizabeth for a while and we've had a few of these conversations, so it's great to be able to take them further. So this is a terrific opportunity.
Definitely.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm very excited to have you. And could you give us your very brief elevator pitch to tell us who you are?
Okay, I'm an historian, and what I'm really interested in is people. And I'm particularly interested in the relationship between people and their environment, how we live and how we can manage to live better in the future. I love stories, and that's part of my skill set in trying to convey those stories and communicate with a wider audience.
I feel I've met a kindred spirit today. So where are you coming to us from today, Margaret?
I am in Ipswich on Niagara country, where I was born, and I have moved back here, so in Ipswich, in southeast Queensland.
So I have to ask you, how did the floods affect you in the last few weeks?
Well, as a flood historian, you would probably assume that I don't live on a floodplain or a hill or near a creek or a river, and I don't. I live on a hill. But we got 580 millimetres in one weekend, which is half our annual rainfall, and our 10,000 litre tank filled very quickly, so I had overland flow from that, and then I had overland flow from this stormwater drains. So I got a lot of water underneath my house. But luckily I'm in a Queenslander, so it will eventually dry out.
Well, that's good. That's good to hear. And yes, I would have expected you to know exactly the best place to live in the Ipswich region.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your history then, Margaret. How have you ended up where you are today?
Okay, well, I started at University of Queensland and I was studying social history. So as I said, I've got that interest in people. So I was looking then at race and gender and issues like that. Then from there, I got a job at the Brisbane City Council looking at heritage, and I was in the heritage unit for a long time. And then I've become a heritage consultant, and I was on the Queensland Heritage Council as its deputy chair for a while. And the reason I tell you that is not so I give you my CV, but so that you can see the trajectory of where I've taken people and place together, because heritage is really where people work and play. So it's the fabric of those stories. And so then I sort of think that moving into environmental history, which is what I'm doing a bit more of now, is a natural progression where I'm looking at people, place, and the environment. So I've sort of got the trifecta going now. So to me, it's sort of a logical progression, or maybe that I've just made that up in my head to make me feel like I've got a logical career.
It sounds very, very logical, but I think our careers are a lot more wibbly wobbly than than people would like them to be. And I think that's really good because we draw on so many aspects of our lives as we go forward. And I think it's that experience that really makes us really understand what's happening around us. So yeah, it's logical, but not logical at the same time, which is perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. Life is not a linear pattern, is it? And that's the exciting thing about it.
It most certainly is not. So you are a published author of the recent books A River with a City Problem, A History of Brisbane Floods, and an edited collection with Scott McKinnon, Masters in Australia and New Zealand, Historical Approaches to Understanding Catastrophe. So how have you ended up writing these books, and what did you kind of learn from them? And, you know, what was unexpected, or was it expected? How did you get to that point in your career or life?
The exciting thing for me about history is it's never expected. It's always the thrill of the chase, and it's always unexpected. And you find those hidden gems in the archives that literally get you dancing inside. So the River with a City Problem book is a product of my PhD. And so then I was able to add a lot of stories and colour and photos and things that you're not allowed to put in a PhD. And what was really interesting to me is how that even though Brisbane's had all of these floods, we really don't know that flood story. And so it was really great to put together those pieces. I see history as a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. Sometimes we describe ourselves as detectives without guns, and we're putting together the story. And it was interesting because people had written about 1893 and 74, 2011, but never putting them together. So that was my challenge. And then through that, I met other people who were sort of playing in this space, if I can say that. So there were oral historians, journalists, and others, all sort of looking at disasters in different ways of looking at them. And so the second edited collection is putting together those different perspectives. And so we've looked at bushfires and cyclones, floods, earthquakes, and some of the things that Australia specialises in, and tried to get an author that wrote a different chapter on each of those from a different perspective. And then we could try and draw threads together and common themes that cross across those disciplines and also those disasters, and try and get some lessons from them. So that was sort of the objective. And it was really great to work with 7 other scholars to get that cross-fertilisation going.
Yeah, that's great with the common themes. And I love the way you just said that, you know, history never is expected, and you've got the thrill of finding the little gems. And with your mention of the book on, you know, different, getting the perspectives of various different historians, is there a common theme that, you know, really resonated with you?
In the disasters book in particular?
Yeah,
we frame disasters always as sort of an inevitable or natural event. But what's really interesting is that human dimension that I think is often left out of it. The human dimension in the stories is usually about the victims, the suffering, the resilience, the recovery. But what we're trying to show is they're actually decisions that we make long before and continue to make. And so what we argue, and from a very biased perspective of historians, is that history will help us understand some of those decisions that we've made that have sort of locked us into these paths, so that we keep building on the floodplain, or we keep building dams, or we keep building in a fire path or whatever. And what we're trying to do is disrupt that. We're disruptors, so that we actually say, we don't have to keep following this path. We said careers aren't linear. Well, neither is history. So you can actually put a big spanner in the works and say, hey, let's not build another dam. Let's think about something different. Maybe we could build in different places. We could build with different materials. We could redesign our cities and our houses. That's what we found, is that those conversations rarely happen, and they need to happen.
Yeah, definitely need to happen. And on that, and like what you were saying kind of brings up the mitigation and adaptation as well on those disasters, and like going back to your river with city problem with the floods as well. You mentioned around, the ecological and technical systems as a fusion of culture and nature, which I think is really good, and that, connection of people and nature. And so what can you share on the history with how people and technology interact?
It's interesting that, because I think we have far too much faith in technology. Technology is fantastic, and as you said, dams do mitigate. There's no doubt whatsoever. I mean, historical data shows that 1974 Brisbane flood, they probably took a metre off it with Somerset Dam. They probably took 2 metres off the flood with Wivenhoe Dam. But what had happened is the council had decided, for reasons I don't totally understand, that it would save 3 metres. So they built to that buffer. And floods are not behavioural problems that we can just solve. They don't follow manuals. They don't follow engineering guidebooks. Nature runs to its own rhythm. And so we can write as many manuals as we like as engineers or scientists, but they will have their problems. And we have created a culture where we think we can solve any problem as humans. We can solve pandemics. We can solve floods. We can solve fires. We can't. We can mitigate them, but people hear mitigation and change it to prevention, or it's done and dusted. We'll never have another flood. We'll get a vaccine and we'll never have another virus. I hate to tell everybody, but that's not how it works. And so I think we have this. It's very complex, because I think we have this faith in engineering, but at the same time, we don't seem to trust engineers. So I think it's very complicated that we see you as the people who might solve our problems, yet when you're put in front of an inquiry, your expertise is also doubted. So I think engineers are in a very difficult position, and I think the community undervalues your skills and the role of expert in general, and it's not just engineers. So I think society needs to think about how we treat our experts as well as our engineering structures and our engineer and scientific solutions. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does.
Yeah,
thank you. I think you've definitely touched on it around, treating experts with, the right way. And I had a few fellow engineers that kind of came into LinkedIn after a journalist had asked some questions, basically probing the engineer that was trying to deal with an emergency situation, and there was just no respect there. And getting the public and community to understand just what the engineer is going through are based on facts, like getting all the information to hand from the weather and the Bureau of Meteorology, and those aspects, as well as the actual engineered systems, both dams and stormwater and everything basically that a city or a town is made up with, getting them to understand that, like that they are talking from facts and reason. They've reasoned, they've gone through risk management as well before they go and probe something in an emergency bit. It would be good to have that general understanding, as well as if you're going to probe in that and doubt people, that's dangerous as well.
Yeah. I'd also like to add that, as well as having done all that study and years of experience, they are also human. I mean, we were all watching the weather changing minute by minute, the rain getting heavier. So we couldn't understand it, but those circumstances are hammering the people that are responsible. They haven't slept for 3 days either. They are human. And I think we need to give some of these disaster managers some latitude. You know, in my book, I actually say that they can sink from hero to villain very, very quickly. And it's not very fair. I mean, the guy who landed the plane on the Hudson River and saved all those people, he didn't follow a rule book, but he became a hero instantly. Now, if he'd crashed and drowned those 300 people, it'd be a very different story. But, you know, he did the best. And I think we need to accept that people are actually fallible and they're not malicious. They're doing the best they can in very difficult circumstances. And I don't think that came out in 2011 at all. I think it came out a little bit better this time, perhaps. I think the communication strategies were probably a little bit better this time, but the same misinformation is always there. But I think hats off to the people who managed the dam this time in an incredibly difficult situation, particularly with the history of how engineers were treated after the last flood.
There's definitely a lot of learnings from engineers.
I think that really works nicely into our next question, because I think around the engineers, scientists as well are struggling with their expertise, particularly around things like climate change, where we're having these discussions and we're still, so many people do not believe it's happening, yet the experts are all saying that it is. So, I mean, one thing that you did mention quite a number of times in the book was that people did not believe that it could be any worse than last time. So it was like 1974, that was the worst it's ever going to get. So we're always, you know, as long as we build within that, we're fine. But then we're going to put a bit of margin down so it's a bit easier. And then, you know, it's the same with things like climate change. It's never going to be any worse than it is, or that was really bad, so that was the worst. Or, you know, bushfires. I remember I was in Victoria during the Black Saturday fires, and that was horrific, but that's the worst it's ever going to be, so we can always mitigate for it. How do we change that attitude? How do we get people to understand that, as you said, you can't completely use technology to completely rid us of any risk?
Yeah,
there's always going to be that risk, and it could be a lot worse than what we've planned for, and that's nobody's fault.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it, that we just cling to the last thing we need to. And I think that's human nature to offer a level of comfort. I really do. I mean, and people just go back to what they remember, and it may be wrong. And it's also, I think, pretty arrogant of humans to assume that, you know, they know better and nature can't do anything different. So I think there's a disrespect there too towards nature. If we're talking about disrespect to scientists and engineers and others, we disrespect nature as well. How we change the conversation is really difficult, but I think it's essential. And if you look at somewhere like Lismore, we've just got to have that conversation, because Lismore, I think they're saying 2,000 houses need to be completely rebuilt. Well, why rebuild them there? We can't just say, oh, well, that will be the biggest one. And even if it is the biggest one, it's still pretty big and shocking. So why replicate that situation? But I don't really know how we change people's perception, and the fact that people are climate deniers mystifies me. But also, even if they are, why don't you just aspire to do things better? You know, if you're an athlete, you try and run faster. If you're a musician, you try and play the piano better. Why do we have to have this existential crisis to make us want to be better people? You know, I don't know why we have to have an external force that makes us do this. So even if we can't cut through that narrative of, oh, this is the worst flood ever or the worst fire ever or whatever, we know it's not going to be, because it wasn't the worst one in the past in some cases either. It's just people have short-term memories and don't respect history. But we could talk about lack of respect to historians another day. But why not just strive to be better? You know, it just seems like a good reason to get out of bed in the morning.
It does, like constantly learning, building from, you know, either your mistakes or you did something but it didn't work out, that, you know, like building on that. And there's definitely a really good case for a lot of engineering projects where you finish a project and you write a whole report about lessons learned, and they're great documents. They're great things to learn on. And like there are, you know, there's things where people do pull that up, but you have to be associated with that project, or know someone associated with that project to really reflect on those lessons, which is a bit of a shame. And then after a certain amount of time, they're kind of forgotten about, unless someone else reminds you. But yeah, I think there's definitely good learn about trying to do stuff within you.
There's the nature of projects too, isn't it? Like if you build a bridge or you build something, you'll write your report. You'll probably draw on that report the next time you build a similar bridge, but it'll be a bridge engineer that reads it. There's not that wider community. It's probably commercial in confidence, so you may not even share it with another engineering practice, much less a wider community. So I think there's a really big role for shared knowledge that we somehow need to do that. And I don't really know how, because I understand capitalism and businesses and so on, but reinventing the wheel is not also a good idea.
Yeah, definitely. Let's not reinvent the wheel. And I think shared knowledge, like even engineering lessons learned, can be applicable for other, stakeholders. And I was writing a feasibility report for a shore approach in a previous job. I pulled together kind of a short summary table that we from consultants, engineering consultants, and then previous lessons learned that I'd learned from project developments. And then got, pulled in the social, pulled in the cultural, pulled in all the environmental elements, so that, the engineering had to look at that. But it was also a good chance for other stakeholders to really see what the engineering challenges are, and actually mainly for the engineering people to see other influences. But, when you've got that shared knowledge with an extended group, I think there's a lot of beneficial things with that. So
but wouldn't it be great to share that with the wider community? Because I don't think the wider community even begins to understand the complexities. Like, let's just build another dam, let's just build another road, let's just build. I mean, all I usually think about is maybe some of the technical stuff, maybe some of the costs, but we don't necessarily look at that whole of societal things like social implications, cultural capital, all of those things that you've just mentioned. And so you end up with having very, very trivial discussions, in my opinion, where you just can build another dam or build another road because the complexities are misunderstood. And I think that's some of the things that are missing from conversations generally, that whilst you've done that analysis, I would suggest not everybody does. And how far does it go? I think that's really important. And I think that's where we need to start taking these, where we start looking at, the bottom line on all of these things is not just dollars, it's the social factors, the cultural factors as well. And I know people think about them a bit, but I don't know that the wider community really understands the complexity, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, indeed. It goes on to that interaction that I know we've talked about in the past of, the convergence of the history, arts, science and engineering professionals, and causing that to be how we do things for the future as well, and how we see that interacting. And that might lead on to another question that Ruth has around technology.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier about how we see technology as a problem solver. Let's just put in this, and that's, for me personally, that's one of the biggest challenges I find around engineering in particular, is let's engineer a solution when the solution is human. So how do we get people to understand that there are no easy solutions, that really sometimes it's cultural change as much as technology that we need to do, or that we need to actually have a very difficult conversation around how we are behaving or acting or doing, rather than go, well, we can carry on doing exactly the same thing, but we're going to put in this technological solution.
Yeah. Economics talks about path dependency, and how if you've done something, you just keep doing it because it's sort of easier. People don't like change, but we are actually capable of change. I mean, 10 years ago even, really, we didn't recycle. You think about it, we didn't even have a recycling bin in our homes. So that's a cultural change. Whilst the engineers and scientists made it possible with the technology to actually process the recycling, it's actually not to the engineers that make me put my paper in the recycling bin. It's a social conscience. It's a social education. So the things that we're doing today actually do start making a difference. If we start telling our students at school and universities, we start having some political strength behind these discussions, you do get cultural change. And cultural change is usually community-led. If you look at any referendum we've had in Australia, most of them fail, but the ones that actually succeed are the ones that the politicians come kicking and screaming about 10 or 20 years too late, like the referendum to give Aboriginal people the vote 20 years after most people have accepted that should have happened, or equal opportunity marriage. I mean, I think a lot of people were already in that space. Governments are reactive. They really, really are. They follow the votes. And if they know the votes are going to go a different way, they will change. But what that is community-led. It's never political-led. I don't think so. Leadership is often lacking. It's responsive, not setting an agenda. So what we need to do is, as I tell my students, I remind them every year that they vote. And it's very important. We need to actually start having really difficult conversations about a whole lot of things. We're just talking today about, natural disasters. And in fact, I don't think they're natural. So there's a point in itself. But they're big grown-up discussions. They involve vision, and they involve more than a 3-year electoral cycle, and they involve some economic commitment, actually putting some money where your mouth is. So we get their mouth there, and then we get their checkbook, and then we'll start having change.
It's interesting you said about natural disasters. Do you think we label these things as natural disasters to give us an out?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You can blame nature. Not our fault. Nature did it. She's evil. She's combative. She's angry. It's always a she. And therefore, it's not our fault. If a tree falls in a forest, it's just a tree falling in the forest. But if you build a house underneath it, your house will get squashed. So that's the anthropogenic factor. The disaster is of our making. Otherwise, it's just what rivers and fires do, isn't it? And floods are good for nature. They clean out river systems. They have ecological benefit. The fish are quite keen on them to a point. Sure, a really bad flood takes out a lot of the environment and the habitat for animals and plants. I'm not saying they're, impact neutral, but the rivers need floods. That's why they have them. So, they will happen whether there's humans on this planet or not. We're actually the ones that can disappear. The rivers came first, which is why I called my book A River with a City Problem. We can drop off the planet and the rivers will probably survive. So we're actually the dispensable people in this story, which is a bit of a shock for humans.
Yeah, you definitely touched on that in your book around, what was there first. And it really goes on to, you can have flooding or a flood. But, who is it that's calling a disaster? And how you kind of manage that to be, it floods, it can bring some good things. It can bring some bad things. You obviously react to that. But definitely there's a bit on, being proactive and listening to the community and educating the community as well. So that social consent kind of reminded me on that social license to operate and how that's so critical.
Yeah.
As a historian, do you think we've become more risk averse? Because we've always lived in these places where there's obviously a trade-off, like living on the side of a volcano, you've got fantastic soils or you've got growth, but there's always been that known risk. Do you think we see technology perhaps as a risk averter, or we've just become less risk averse?
Oh, I think you've absolutely hit on something very important. I think we are definitely more risk averse. I think we've put too much faith in government to save us from all sorts of things. Some of them are completely irrational. Some of them are logical. And we've definitely put too much faith in historically and more so now in science and engineering. I think we do think that you guys can solve everything, and whilst that might be flattering, it's not actually real. And I think because we've got this big brother approach to government, the government will give us, help us all the time. I think it does make us more risk adverse and probably a little less individually responsible for some of the decisions that we make. And that's not to blame victims for a second. I have infinite sympathy for people who are flooded. I'm not blaming the victim at all. I'm actually blaming some of the systems that let them live there in the first place. But we need to be a bit more attuned to our environment. In October last year, the ants started acting differently. You knew it was an El Nino year. The odds of a flood were growing, but did people take any action? Did people, start moving stuff? Did they? So I think people can be a little bit immune to the risk or not even really aware of the risk. I mean, I hadn't even really seriously contemplated overland flow of that volume at my own house, and I'm a flood historian, So I would think if people like us can get flooded, then there's going to be a lot of people who are even less aware of risk.
Yeah, indeed. And it's good mention around, what the ants were doing, back last year as well. And as I was saying to Ruth, I was looking at, there's a really great website that tracks marine heat waves. And back in December and January, there were so many heat waves off Australia. And there was like a lot off the East Coast tracking down. And you're just thinking these marine heat waves can last, weeks. That can get onto that. So the oceans are warm with the La Nina system, and there was warnings from the Bureau around this would be one of the wettest seasons. With climate change and oceans warming, expect more of this rain, constant rain. If you're going to have marine heat waves as well.
Yeah. And what was interesting about this flood, if I can interrupt, unlike say 2011, is we had a really wet summer. It had been raining a lot. So we should have actually been a little bit more aware. It was a bit different in 2011 because we'd had that long drought. So I think people weren't quite as aware of the risk of flood. But in short-term memory, and obviously we talked about the problems of memory, but in my short-term memory, this was one of my wettest summers. I had fewer swims than I've had in other summers. It was wet. So again, yes, it was surprising that it flooded in the creeks where it didn't flood there in 2011, but it did in 74. So people were probably basing it on the last flood. But it had been very wet, so the overland flow and the flow rates and so on were going to be significant when we did get that rain. And people had been forecasting it for months. In fact, there was even a suggestion that we might get it last summer. So it shouldn't have been as much of a surprise as it seemed to be for a lot of people.
That's interesting you say that, because one of the things that I noticed while I was reading the book is the issue of communication. And obviously, as history's gone over, the communication was interrupted for, a lot easier than it is now with, telephone lines being disrupted and all that sort of thing. Do you think that now we've got to the point where there's actually too much information? It's actually hard to filter out the noise.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. But it's also interesting that our technology is not as robust as you think. In 1893, we lost the telegram. In 74, we lost the telephone. And in 2011, our internet's all crashed. I mean, we all tell people to check your flood maps and your rain data, but if your internet's gone down and you've lost your power, as so many houses actually did, our technology in the communications sphere is not, as rigorous and robust as we might like. And yes, there's a heck of a lot of noise. It's really hard to cut through that. And I think that's something we can think about is our communication strategies of working out what messages need to come out, when they should come out, and who's got the authority to give those messages at a particular time. It comes back a bit to the trust issue of who do you actually listen to. And sometimes people listen to their neighbour rather than bomb. I mean, who knows why? But and also we'll now be on to our next disaster pretty soon. We're already talking about fires in Western Australia. We'll go into when I published this book, no one wanted to talk to me because we were doing bushfires. They said, oh, sorry, we're on to the next disaster. So we've got this little window now where everyone's talking about floods, but it won't last. And so then they'll say, oh, we can't talk about floods anymore because we're too busy worrying about the cyclone season or something. So that's part of our problem for our long-term. And as I said before, long-term planning is so important in this, but we get these little windows. There's a lot of social scientists that say our moods wax and wane with the flood height. So that, as the waters go down, so does the impetus for change. So we need to seize the day and have some of these conversations, but not sort of let them peter out when the cleanup's over. And I think that's cutting through that noise is really, really hard. But maybe there's a chance to think about communications packages in the next year that are ready for the next one, because there will be a next one, as we know.
There will be a next one. Yeah, that's a really good point on the communication aspects and getting the window now and seeing if you can kind of, make the point to actually we need to keep this conversation going so we can change from a reactive to a proactive as well.
We talked before about commonalities in the disasters. This isn't, some of the processes are the same. I mean, getting people out of a fire zone or a flood zone are not entirely different. So the communication strategy can have some similarities. So even if we are moving on to fire or cyclone, some of the messaging is the same. And the other thing I think we've seen from 2011 is how important coordination is between all these different organisations, which was sadly lacking in some communities. And so I think one of the things you can do in the supposed downtime between crises is to get those strategies in place and get those structures talking together better. And that is one of the positives of the 2011 flood in Queensland. I saw that more working better in Queensland than it did in New South Wales. So we do learn from history. We do improve. I just probably want to speed it up a bit.
There are some good case study, but I definitely agree with you on the speeding things up as well. So we have a theme on humanising STEM, or science, technology, engineering, arts and maths. We note that you talk about humanising the landscape with places and names. Is there something that here where we can pull out in a socio-technical systems that, maybe can be utilised somewhere, or something else where you can see how that can be deployed, or just how much that humanising the landscape really matters or is influenced?
I think I get the premise of your question. I'm not tired. I may be wrong, so correct me if I am. Are you talking about how we can understand our landscape better, or are we talking about how we can communicate the terminology? Which one what are we wanting to talk about?
Maybe there's two aspects here.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll do that second one, the terminology thing, because I think scientific and engineering terminology doesn't translate very well. I mean, we talk about the flood being at the Brisbane Gauge. The shock for a lot of engineers is that most of us don't know where the Brisbane Gauge is. I didn't until I started researching floods. So telling me it's going to be 9 metres at the Brisbane Gauge means literally nothing, and it means really nothing in Ipswich when it's going to be 19 metres. So one of the things we're not very good at doing is hooking measurements to landmarks. So if you told me it was going to be halfway up the Jindalee Bridge, I would understand that. So 1 in 100 years is a whole other minefield. I mean, the poor Premier of New South Wales got himself completely tied in knots with when it was 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 500. Or I think it's pretty irrelevant. And that was just a shorthand that the engineers developed in America to help understand risk. But as we've already discussed, people don't understand risk anyway. So maybe we need to abandon that language, because I don't think it helps. No one lives for 100 years anyway. So, and it doesn't mean that anyway. It means we've got, whatever percent each day. So it all it does is make people chill for 99 years. So it's not very helpful. And I think there's a whole lot of, we talk about moderate, major and minor floods. That doesn't mean anything. If you tell me it's a moderate flood, I'm thinking, oh, that doesn't sound too bad. Moderate floods are bad. They, especially if you're at Breakfast Creek, they're really bad. So I think we need to be really mindful of how people in the general community actually understand this terminology. But we're talking about the land and understanding the land. It astonishes me that people who live in Creek Street don't understand that it might flood. Or, why do you think it's got that name? So our disconnect from the land is really quite shocking. I think country people might be more attuned with the land, but I'm told that that's an overgeneralization that I shouldn't make. Some people in the city are very attuned, but I think, again, when we talk about Aboriginal culture, they're very attuned with their land and their landscape, and they can read these signs. Most of us can't do that, and maybe we need to learn to do it.
Yeah, that Indigenous culture and engineering over the years, I think, is something that we need to go back to more and more. And it is something that's been more of an attention with engineering. Right. But, yeah, definitely more of it and fast as well. I think you've highlighted with the communication systems just around, communicating it so it's clear, but then understanding how people are comprehending that communication.
Yeah.
And, you can't necessarily have one way to communicate. You need to have multiple ways to communicate that as well.
Yeah. And we assume literacy levels that we don't all have. And that doesn't mean literacy in English. Most people, including me, are not that good at reading maps. Maps are challenging. So translating a map that's very obvious to you, or an engineering diagram of a flood height, doesn't tell me whether it's going to run into my house or not. And in the moment when the water is actually rising, I've got no time to analyse that flood map. So, I've heard flood engineers saying they found some of the flood maps hard to read last week when they were trying to translate it onto the ground. So if those people can't do it, I would suggest there's a lot of people who can't do it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think, we do need to do better. It comes back to that communication piece, at communicating at the level of the people we're talking to, not at the level of the information that we're giving out. Mm-hmm. It really does need to be done better, because from a diversity perspective, particularly, we need to include more voices in the discussion, and we need people to actually be able to tell their stories and share their experiences so that we can learn from them. Because if we're all speaking different technical languages, those stories don't come out.
Yeah. We also assume most people speak English. And we found that in COVID, is that the COVID strategies, particularly in Melbourne, didn't work because there were lots of people who don't speak English. So sending them a leaflet with a whole lot of English words on it is pointless. And we know we've got some vulnerable communities in Brisbane. The Vietnamese communities, for example, in Darra are pretty vulnerable. So giving them a flood sheet in English is not useful. We need to identify who are the community leaders in those places before the flood or before the fire, so that we empower them to be able to give the information that those communities need in the language and the terminology, in the strategy that they need. They may not have Facebook. They probably don't own mobile phones. Sending them a flood warning as a text message assumes you've got a mobile phone with text message capacity. I got one. I have a mobile phone. But did my neighbours, less affluent neighbours, have that access to that information? I don't know. I suspect not.
And these are the questions that we also need to be asking, because if we're not asking them, we don't know either. No. So there's that assumption there. So yeah, we really do need to be having these discussions and understanding who knew what and when, so that we can go, okay, well, why didn't you know, or what can we do better next time? But without the blame. And I think that's something that is almost, it seems to be, we need to have somebody to blame constantly, whether it's, the engineer at the end, or the person who signed it off, or, the person that did their best. We need to do better with inquiries, we actually just want to know what happened so we can not do it again next time.
Yeah, and apportioning blame doesn't really help, does it? Because all it does is pit expert against expert, media against media, community against community, and no one wins in that. And we don't end up any wiser at the end of it. We just end up with a big bill for an inquiry.
Yeah, indeed. Like getting the inquiries so they go beyond the blame, shame, and just moving it on from a space of learning, understanding, and then, going forward and solving that. Not making anyone wrong.
No, just getting the best minds in the room to talk through these issues. That's what inquiries like that should be. And diverse minds. So it's not just two experts, or where are the community voices, where are the diversity issues? I mean, you see photos of the flood inquiry, there's very much type in that room. So there were voices missing as well.
Yeah.
So to change track completely, tell us what are you reading at the moment? What do you enjoy reading or listening to? And has there been something recently that's changed your outlook about anything in particular?
Yeah, actually, and the answer may surprise you. I actually read a lot, and that probably doesn't surprise you, but I really like crime novels. All right?
Oh, wow.
I do, and I think it's that thrill of the chase thing, and not necessarily the violent ones. And the ones I really like are Jane Harper and Chris Hammer. And the reason I like them is because they make the Australian environment a character. And it's made me think about that a lot in my own writing and my own thinking, because that's why those books resonate. And the film The Dry was fantastic, because I could almost smell that dry landscape and hear the grass crunching underfoot and so on. And I think Australians need to learn a lot more about their environment, but I also think it is different. And I think if we can take some of those techniques that fiction writers use, they're taking their audience with them far more than we are. And I think if we can try and use some of those literary devices where we can really make the environment quite central in these discussions, that's really important. And that's what they do. So I actually want to try and use those techniques more in my own writing so that people can hear and smell those floods, because I think if you get an emotive connection with them, you'll start thinking about them differently. So I actually have been thinking more about how I can use fiction.
That's really interesting, because I think it again comes back to that storytelling piece about how do we tell these stories better without, yes, you need the data and you need the information, but you also need to engage people and really bring them along on the story, because otherwise if they don't resonate with it, then they don't really comprehend it or take it in the same way. So I think it's very important we start to tell those stories very differently than perhaps we have in the past.
Yeah, so that's my challenge, isn't it?
I have to say, I found River with a City Problem a very engaging book. The fact that I digested the whole thing in a weekend, it was like, I can't put this down. But maybe that's the engineering me as well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So I sort of tried to use some of those literary devices, and it's very handy that the floods were we had a dam in between. So I did have a narrative spine, so that was quite nice. So I tried to enliven the text with oral histories and newspaper accounts where I could, to try and make the people the story as well, and to try and animate the science as much as possible without dumbing it down. I was trying to be as respectful to the science as possible, because otherwise people like you won't read it. And it's really important to get the science right. So I did try very hard. I'm sure I made errors, but I did try my best. As I said, we're human. But I think it's really important that we start thinking about holistically how we communicate. And journalists can be our friend and our foe, but we need to work with them to start using their own skills, for our stories.
Yeah, totally agree.
Collaboration, definitely. I love the character and going into fiction. I know one thing about like floods, like I was on holidays in 2011 and then here staying West End for the recent floods, and the two, like I had a lot of things from the 2011, probably more so than this flood, but both times were the smell. Like that just stays with you when you help clean out and for days and weeks after.
Yeah, and I think that's the opening sentence in my book. It's the smell people remember. And years later when it rains, the houses still have that smell. It doesn't really go away. So it brings out PTSD and a whole lot of issues. So it's very real. It's a visceral connection with that disaster. And I try, and when I tell history, to bring it down to that individual level, because that's what I like. I like human individual stories. So I figure I'm probably not the only one. And you can tell little stories of individuals to tell bigger stories. So if you can tell the story of one person's flood, you can extrapolate that into the story of 1,000 people's floods. But it becomes very personal when they're going through their private photograph collection that's destroyed. So it makes it real.
So we've got a final question. If 42 is the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe and everything, what do we need to achieve it, Margaret?
We need to start listening. We need to break down those silos and start listening to as many people as possible. We all got our own little expertise and our own little passions, but what we're not very good at doing is getting them all together. And STEAM is really important in that space. So in my world, we would all be at the table as a diverse group, an Indigenous spokesperson, the settler opinions, engineers, science, humanities, and just deal with these issues. They're wicked problems, they call them. They need a lot of good brains around the table. I'd like to get rid of the politics. I'd like to get rid of the blame. And I'd just like some really smart, forward-looking thinking. Rather than reactive, I want to start being proactive. So that's my answer. Proactive, not reactive. That would be my wish.
I think that's a great wish. That really resonates with me as well. I'd love to see the relationship between historians, arts, science and engineering, and those professionals really coming together and growing, breaking down the silos and forming bridges as well with those silos.
We'll all be richer for it, won't we? I mean, I have learned so much from engineers writing this book. I've got a lot of people like yourselves that I've got to know. I've met hydrologists, and you're all good at sharing your expertise. So, you there is a willingness on both sides to share. We just need to somehow capitalise on that so that we start talking to the leaders and the political decision makers, because we've got the expertise. We just need to somehow use it better, I think.
Yeah, totally agree. Really, really do. I think, but breaking down those silos and really having some difficult conversations, and no one says they're going to be easy, but really just having everybody in the room there to listen and understand their perspective. And I think sometimes we like to force our own perspectives on a situation because that's how it's impacted us without listening to those other sides of the story. So yeah, totally agree that I think that's a great way to end today. So thank you so much for your time this afternoon, Margaret. Really appreciate it. It's been fascinating. As I said, really loved the book. I found it a great story, but also really insightful as well. So I highly recommend it. I did have one little last question for you. I saw your book first on Twitter and it went completely crazy. How did you deal with your sudden fame in the social media world?
The last 2 weeks has been unbelievable. In between cleaning up my own house, I was doing radio interviews and writing conversation articles. So it's been a couple of weeks with very little sleep. But I think it's really important because I said I've got that window to try and get the messages before they start talking about something else. I probably didn't see it coming quite so much. I've learned a lot, which is always good because I love learning. But it's been a little insight into another world out there. So it's been interesting.
Well, that's fantastic. And thank you so much for joining us in your whirlwind of a few weeks then. We really, really do appreciate your time. And it's been really, really great talking to you.
Absolutely. I've loved talking to you too as well. So I think it's shown that STEAM people can work together very, very well.
Indeed. Yes. Thank you, Margaret.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth.